Warning, this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. The cursor hovered over the unmarked link, its bold red letters pulsing on the screen like a forbidden invitation. Jason had always been curious about the dark web, its hidden corners, its unspoken horrors. The promise of something disturbing, something real, had lured him into this twisted labyrinth. Tonight, his boredom had led him to the most notorious site, the pit. The site was crude, minimalist. A single window flickered to life, revealing a dimly lit room with concrete walls. Chains hung from the ceiling, glinting under the cold, harsh light. A figure slumped in the center of the room, bound to a metal chair, their face hidden behind a blood-soaked sack. The title flashed across the top of the screen, tonight's feature, Live Torment. Jason's pulse quickened. He couldn't look away. The chat on the side of the screen buzzed with eager anticipation. Start already. Show us the pain. Rip him apart. A door creaked open in the room, and a man dressed in black leather stepped into view. His face was obscured by a cracked porcelain mask, but his cold, deliberate movements hinted at the horrors he'd performed before. In his hand, he held a rusted bone saw, the kind used in slaughterhouses, its blade already crusted with dried blood. Jason's stomach churned, but his eyes were glued to the screen. With a sickening screech, the masked man began dragging the saw along the bound figure's arm, the blade slowly biting into flesh. The muffled screams that followed were like music to the twisted audience watching. The chat exploded with glee. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as the torturer switched tools, brandishing a pair of jagged pliers. With a casual flick of his wrist, he yanked off a fingernail, the sound of flesh tearing resonating through the speakers. The victim writhed in agony, but the bindings held firm. This is messed up, Jason thought, but something inside him compelled him to reach for a blowtorch. A message suddenly appeared in the chat. Jason, we see you. His blood ran cold. For a moment, he thought it was some kind of sick joke, but then his screen flickered. The feed wasn't just showing the torture room anymore, it was showing his room. His webcam light blinked red. Someone was watching him. He froze, panic gripping him. The chat box filled with new comments. He's next. Run, Jason. They're coming for you. Jason's hands fumbled over the keyboard, trying to exit the site, but it was locked. The screen went black, and when it returned, the camera feed showed an empty street. His street. The figure in the porcelain mask appeared on the corner. Slowly approaching his building, dragging the saw along the pavement. The screech of metal against concrete sent a jolt of terror through Jason's body. He darted to the door, bolting every lock, but his mind raced. How had they found him? Was this real? The pounding began moments later, slow, methodical thuds on the door. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps as the torturer's voice echoed from his laptop, garbled and distorted. You're next, Jason. Don't try to hide. His phone buzzed. A new message. We're watching. Enjoy the show. Attached was a photo of his front door, taken moments ago. In desperation, Jason ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife he could find. The door rattled. The lock straining against the force from the other side. With a final crash, it flew open, revealing the masked man, now holding a jagged meat cleaver. Jason lunged, but the figure sidestepped him with ease, driving the cleaver into his side. Pain exploded through Jason's body as he crumpled to the floor, blood spilling across the tiles. The torturer moved over him, pulling out a grotesque collection of torture tools from a leather satchel: pliers, scalpels, hammers. His cold, emotionless eyes gleamed behind the mask as he selected a small... As the torturer reached for a blowtorch, a message suddenly appeared in the chat. "Jason, we see you." His blood ran cold. For a moment, he thought it was some kind of sick joke, but then his screen flickered. The feed wasn't just showing the torture room anymore, it was showing his room. His webcam light blinked red. Someone was watching him. He froze, panic gripping him. The chat box filled with new comments. "He's next. Run, Jason. They're coming for you." Jason's hands fumbled over the keyboard, trying to exit the site, but it was locked. The screen went black, and when it returned, the camera feed showed an empty street. His street. The figure in the porcelain mask appeared on the corner, slowly approaching his building, dragging the saw along the pavement. The screech of metal against concrete sent a jolt of terror through Jason's body. He darted to the door, bolting every lock, but his mind raced. How had they found him? Was this real? The pounding began moments later, slow, methodical thuds on the door. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps as the torturer's voice echoed from his laptop, garbled and distorted. "You're next, Jason. Don't try to hide." His phone buzzed. A new message: "We're watching. Enjoy the show." Attached was a photo of his front door, taken moments ago. In desperation, Jason ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife he could find. The door rattled, the lock straining against the force from the other side. With a final crash, it flew open, revealing the masked man, now holding a jagged meat cleaver. Jason lunged, but the figure sidestepped him with ease, driving the cleaver into his side. Pain exploded through Jason's body as he crumpled to the floor, blood spilling across the tiles. The torturer moved over him, pulling out a grotesque collection of torture tools from a leather satchel: pliers, scalpels, hammers. His cold, emotionless eyes gleamed behind the mask as he selected. He knelt beside Jason, pressing the drill's bit against his hand. Jason screamed, the sound echoing in his ears as the drill bit into bone. The pain was unbearable, and his vision blurred with tears and blood. But the torture wasn't done. With cruel precision, he used the scalpel to carve deep, agonizing cuts along Jason's arms and legs, making sure he stayed conscious to feel every moment of it. Jason's world became a haze of blood and screams, every second stretching into an eternity of torment. The laptop screen flickered to life once more. The chat was alive with excitement. "He's almost done. Show us the final cut. Make it hurt." Jason's mind raced, searching for any way out. But his body was already weakening. The masked man's final move was slow and deliberate. He reached for the bone saw once again, this time pressing it against Jason's throat. The chat roared in approval. As the blade bit into his flesh, Jason's vision darkened, his blood soaking the floor. His last thought, a fleeting whisper in his mind, was one of Jason's vision blurred, a haze of blood seeping into his eyes as the masked figure stood over him, the saw ready to make the final cut. His pulse throbbed in his ears, every heartbeat a countdown to oblivion. The last of his strength ebbed away, and Jason welcomed the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision, and then silence. The bone saw stopped mere inches from his throat, the blade dripping with Jason's blood. The masked man tilted his head, as though listening to something only he could hear. Jason, gasping and slipping in and out of consciousness, managed to crack open his swollen eyelids just enough to see the man step back. The laptop screen flickered again, "Not yet." Those two words flashed across the screen, typed by some unseen hand in the dark web chat. The masked man straightened, clicking off the bone saw and setting it aside. Jason's tortured body convulsed in pain as he tried to focus, tried to comprehend why his death had been delayed. "There's more to come." The torturer didn't speak, but Jason could feel the shift in the room, an oppressive presence that seemed to reach through the screen itself. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps. Why weren't they finishing him off? He could hear the chat buzzing again, the audience hungry for more blood. More violence. More torment. The masked man reached into his leather satchel again and pulled out a new tool. This one, a pair of garden shears, the kind used to prune branches but clearly repurposed for something far darker. He approached Jason with deliberate slowness, dragging the tip of the blades along the ground, creating a sharp metallic screech that echoed off the walls. Jason's mind screamed for him to move, to run, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by pain and fear. His skin crawled as the torturer crouched next to him, the dull glint of the With no warning, the masked man clamped the shears onto Jason's index finger. The cold metal bit into the bone, grinding it with merciless precision. The pain was instantaneous, white-hot, as the torturer snipped through muscle, tendons, and bone. Jason's scream pierced the air, louder than any sound he'd made before, his vision swimming in and out as the masked man severed the finger completely. Blood gushed onto the floor, and the chat exploded with approval. "That's it. Cut him more. Finish him slowly. Use the other tools." Jason writhed on the floor, clutching his mutilated hand to his chest, barely able to comprehend what was happening. His entire body was a symphony of agony. His mind drowning in the torture that refused to end. The masked man stood, seemingly satisfied for the moment, and walked back to the camera. He tilted it downward, showing Jason's mutilated form to the audience, an intimate close-up of the destruction he had wrought. The chat was alive with comments, thousands of faceless strangers typing their sadistic desires, urging the torturer to continue. But as the man turned back toward Jason, something happened. The lights in the room flickered once, then twice, before plunging the room into complete darkness. Jason's breath hitched as silence fell, broken only by his ragged sobs. The screen on the laptop blinked, and new text appeared in the chat window. "We control the feed now." Jason's heart stuttered in confusion. What did that mean? Who controlled the feed? Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, but the masked man was gone. The room was empty, save for Jason's broken body sprawled on the cold floor. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were too weak, too battered. The laptop pinged again. "We're not done with you." His head snapped toward the screen, terror flooding his veins. The camera was still broadcasting live, the chat still filled with hundreds of viewers, but something even more sinister was happening made the hairs on Jason's neck stand on end. His mind, already clouded by agony, was struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. The door at the far end of the room creaked open slowly, as if being pushed by an unseen hand. From the shadows beyond the doorway, another figure emerged. This one was different. It was dressed in tattered robes, its face obscured by a long, hooded cloak. Jason's stomach churned. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the floor, its pale hands reaching out as it approached Jason's crippled form. Jason's breath came in rapid bursts, his body too weak to escape. His mind screaming for him to run, but he was paralyzed by fear. The cloaked figure reached him, its cold hands hovering over his blood-soaked body. It spoke then, its voice a whisper that echoed like 1,000 screams in his ears. "You are part of the ritual now." Before Jason could react, the figure's hands pressed down on his chest, and a searing pain unlike anything he had ever experienced ripped through him. His body convulsed violently as the figure whispered dark incantations, words in a language he couldn't understand. His vision blurred again, his mind slipping into unconsciousness as the pain consumed him. Just before everything went black, Jason heard the last thing he would ever hear, the figure's voice. Deep and guttural, whispering directly into his ear, "Welcome to eternal torment." Jason's world faded into oblivion. When he awoke, the air was cold, so cold it burned his lungs. His eyes fluttered open to find himself lying on a stone altar, chains bolted to his wrists and ankles. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. Above him, towering stone walls stretched into the sky, and beyond that, an eternal blackness that made him feel small. For him, their faces obscured by hoods and masks, their hands covered in blood. The air smelled of rot and decay, and the low murmur of a crowd reached his ears, though the words were indistinguishable. He wasn't alone. Jason's heart pounded as he realized where he was, the pit. It wasn't just a site on the dark web, wasn't just a place for sick entertainment. It was a gateway, and he had crossed through. The chat window appeared again in his mind, but this time it was burned into the darkness itself, an endless feed of comments from faceless watchers. "New victim in the pit. Watch him suffer." This is where the real torment begins. He tried to scream, to beg for mercy. But his voice was gone. The figures began to move in unison, their hands reaching for cruel, ancient tools, a jagged knife, a branding iron, a set of twisted hooks. Jason's body tensed as they descended upon him, and the first cut was made. The pain was unbearable, slicing through his skin and into his soul. The figures worked with precision, pulling skin from flesh, severing tendons, and carving symbols into his bones. Every nerve in his body screamed, but no sound escaped him. He was trapped in a hell of endless torment, a nightmare that would never end. The watchers were still there, always watching. Always waiting for the next cut, the next scream, the next drop of blood. Jason had become more than a victim. He was now a prisoner of the pit, a spectacle for those who thrived on the darkest corners of the human soul. His pain, his suffering, his eternal torment would never end, and somewhere, deep in the void, the chat continued to buzz, the next show digging. Every part of my training told me to drop it, walk away. Let the tech guys handle the dark web crap, they were better at tracking these creeps. But something about the pit stuck with me. Maybe it was the chat logs we found during the initial investigation, or maybe it was just the way the victims had disappeared without a trace, no bodies, no evidence. Just the sickening feeling that they'd vanished into something far worse than death. I hadn't told anyone else at the station. They'd think I was losing it, too deep in the muck after years on the force. But I couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of my head. The missing people, the dark websites, none of it made sense unless you looked at it like a pattern. Something darker, something that went beyond just sadistic killers. My first break came when I found Jason's case. The poor bastard had been missing for months, but his digital footprint was all over the place. Weird, right? If he was dead, how was someone still logging into his accounts? I traced his last known activity to a hidden IP, a site called The Pit. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. I'd seen a lot of shit on the job, serial killers, abductions, brutal homicides, but there was something different here. Something colder. I was off duty when I made the decision. I knew it was a bad idea, that I could get myself killed or worse, but I couldn't help it. I had to see for myself what the hell was going on. So, one night, I went home, poured myself a drink, and started digging. The interface was simple, crude even. No fancy graphics, no obvious sign it was a streaming platform. Just a black screen with a countdown, next show starts soon. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to shut the laptop and walk away, but I couldn't. I had to know. What was this? A snuff film? A live stream of a brutal killing? Why? The countdown hit 0, the screen flickered to life, and immediately, I regretted everything. A dark room appeared, illuminated by a single overhead light. Chains hung from the ceiling, still swaying as if someone had just brushed by them. In the center of the room was a steel chair. Strapped to it, a man, the same man I'd been tracking for weeks, Jason. My stomach twisted. He was still alive. Barely. The chat on the side of the screen exploded with excitement. Tear him apart. Make him scream. Start with the eyes. I forced myself to focus. I needed to understand what I was looking at, but the sight of Jason's mangled body was almost too much. His fingers were missing. Jagged stumps where his nails should have been, and the skin on his arms had been peeled back in long, grotesque strips. His face, God, his face, was a swollen mass of bruises and blood, barely recognizable. Then, a figure stepped into view. The man wore a cracked porcelain mask, his movements slow and deliberate. He circled Jason like a predator sizing up its prey. In his hand was something new, a barbed whip, the kind used for tearing through flesh like it was paper. The chat was practically buzzing with anticipation as the torturer made his way behind Jason. I clenched my fists, my knuckles white as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. The first lash struck, a brutal, wet crack as the barbs ripped into Jason's back. His body jerked violently, but the restraints held him in place. He tried to scream, but all that came out was a rasp, a dry, broken sound of someone who no longer had the strength to beg for mercy. Snap out of it, I thought to myself. Do something. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I knew I was out of my depth, but I had to try. I copied the IP, sent it to my contact at the cyber unit. They needed to see this. But in my gut, I knew we wouldn't be fast enough. Whoever these people were, they'd been careful, and time to see the torturer switch tools again. This time, it was a drill. The handheld kind with a long, rusted bit that glinted under the dim light. He positioned it against Jason's shoulder, just above the bone. Jason's eyes rolled back, his entire body trembling. He knew what was coming. I knew what was coming. The drill whirred to life, the bit slowly sinking into flesh, grinding against bone. Jason's mouth opened in a silent scream, his body thrashing in a futile attempt to escape. The sound of the drill cutting through muscle and bone was like nails on a chalkboard, and for a moment, I thought I might vomit. The chat was a frenzy of sadistic pleasure. Yes. Deeper. More blood. Make him bleed. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse racing, my mind spinning. I needed to stop this, but how? It wasn't just a website. This was something darker, more organized. A network of monsters feeding off the pain of others. And Jason, he was just the latest victim. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The image of Jason's mutilated body, the sound of the drill grinding into him, it replayed in my head on a loop. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I could still save him, but deep down, I knew the truth. He was as good as dead. The next morning, I walked into the station like a zombie. My head was pounding. My hands shaking. I needed to tell someone, but who would believe me? I'd crossed a line, gone too far into the abyss. I headed straight to the cyber unit, my mind racing. When I got there, my contact, Stevens, was already waiting for me. "You look like hell," he said, pushing a cup of coffee into my hands. "You didn't get any sleep, did you?" I shook my head, taking a sip of the bitter liquid. "I found him, Stevens. I found Jason." Stevens raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. I nodded, pulling out my phone and showing him the message I'd sent the night before. "It's all there. The stream, the torture, it's live. He's still alive, but not for long." Stevens paled as he read the message, then looked up at me. "Jesus. We need to move now." He turned to his team, barking orders. Computers whirred to life, screens lit up, and the room buzzed with activity. They were tracing the IP, trying to find any way to track it, but I could tell from the looks on their faces that it wasn't going well. Hours passed, and my nerves were shot. Every second felt like a lifetime as I paced the room, waiting for any kind of update. Then, finally, Stevens approached me, his face grim. "We found something," he said, his voice low. "But it's not what we expected." He handed me a printout, a series of coordinates. I frowned, my pulse quickening. "Coordinates? What the hell does that mean?" Stevens hesitated before speaking. "They're leading us somewhere. I don't know who sent them, but they're legit. If we follow them, we might find the pit." My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. My one chance to stop these bastards and save Jason. If it wasn't too late, I grabbed my gear, Stevens and a small tactical team close behind. We moved quickly, the tension palpable as we sped toward the coordinates. The location was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Typical horror movie shit. The place looked like it had been deserted for years. Crumbling walls, shattered windows, and a thick layer of grime covering everything. But I knew better. This wasn't some random spot. This was where they kept Jason. We moved in silently, sweeping through the corridors, our guns drawn, our breaths shallow. Every corner felt like a trap waiting to spring, every shadow a potential threat. The further we went, the colder it got, like the air itself was suffocating us. The warehouse reeked of decay and something else, fear. It was the kind of place where people disappeared, swallowed up by the void, their screams absorbed into the crumbling walls. Every step we took echoed unnervingly, our breaths the only sound breaking the silence. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse a relentless drumbeat in my ears. I could feel it now, the weight of what I was about to face. We moved down a long corridor, its walls smeared with filth, the paint peeling off in long, sickly strips. The deeper we went, the more the reality of it sank in. I wasn't just chasing a lead anymore. I was stepping into something far more sinister than I'd ever imagined. At the end of the hallway, a door stood ajar. Faint light flickered from within, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance with malice. My hand tightened around my gun, sweat slicking my grip as I pushed the door open. The room inside was everything I'd feared and more. Chains hung from the ceiling like grotesque decorations, some still dripping with fresh blood. Torture tools, rusted saws, bone-cutting knives, drills, were neatly arranged on a metal table, each one gleaming under the flickering light. The walls were covered in dark stains, splashes of blood that had dried long ago, a testament to the horrors that had taken place here, and in the center of it all was Jason. He was barely recognizable. His body was a mass of open wounds, his skin flayed in places, hanging off him in ragged strips. His eyes, sunken and hollow, stared blankly into the darkness. He wasn't screaming anymore, he couldn't. His throat had been slit, not deep enough to kill him instantly, but enough to keep him on the edge of death. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat as I took a step forward. "Jason," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We're here. We're gonna get you out." His eyes flickered, barely a sign of life, but it was enough. Enough to know he was still there. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the light bulbs swaying overhead. Then, the sound started. A low, metallic creak, like a door being opened in the distance. My heart raced as I spun around, gun raised, scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the shadows, stretching and shifting like they had a life of their own. And then I heard it, a voice, distorted and hollow, coming from somewhere above us. "Welcome to the pit." It was the voice from the live stream. The same voice I'd heard narrating Jason's torture. Cold, detached, filled with a sadistic pleasure that sent chills down my spine. "We've been watching you," the voice continued, echoing off the walls. "You've made it further than most. But now, it's your turn." The floor beneath us shook, a low rumble building from somewhere deep below. Suddenly, the chains rattled, and a hidden door in the far corner slid open. From the darkness, two figures emerged, their faces obscured by the same cracked porcelain masks I'd seen on the live stream. They moved with purpose, their footsteps slow, deliberate. One of them held a large set of bolt cutters, the other a handheld torch, the blue flame flickering ominously as they approached Jason. "No!" I shouted, my voice raw, my mind screaming in horror. I raised my gun and fired. But the bullets seemed to do nothing. They moved forward relentlessly, unflinching, as if the pain meant nothing to them. I was out of time. The man with the torch bent down, lighting it with a flick of his wrist. The flame burst to life with a harsh hiss, its heat almost palpable from where I stood. The second figure stepped behind Jason, and with a quick, brutal motion, snapped the restraints, collapsed forward, his body a broken mess, but they didn't stop. The torch was pressed to his back, the flames scorching his already mangled flesh. The sound of sizzling skin filled the room, followed by the sickening stench of burning meat. Jason's body twitched, a final, instinctive reaction, but no scream came. He was beyond that now. I fired again, aiming for their heads, but they barely flinched. The porcelain masks cracked, but whatever was behind them wasn't human. I stumbled back, the full weight of the horror crashing down on me. This wasn't just a snuff film. This was something far worse. They turned their attention toward me now, slowly advancing, tools in hand. My breath quickened, panic setting in. I couldn't outrun them, and my bullets did nothing. I needed to think, needed a way out, but the room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing down on me. I backed into a corner, my heart hammering against my ribs as they came closer. The torch hissed, and I could feel its heat, even from several feet away. Then, the voice echoed again, cruel and taunting. "You thought you could stop us? You're just like the rest. Another piece in our show." The masked figure with the bolt cutter stepped forward, lifting the heavy tool. I could see my reflection in the gleaming metal, my fear, my desperation. And then, with a sickening crunch, the cutters clamped down on my wrist. White-hot pain exploded through my body as the bone snapped, my hand severed cleanly at the wrist. Blood poured from the wound, pooling on the floor beneath me. My vision blurred, spots of black dancing at the edges of my sight, but I fought to stay conscious. I wasn't going to die here. Not like this. With my good hand, I grabbed the torch from the ground, its flame still sputtering. I swung it wildly, managing to catch one of the figures, revealing the twisted, inhuman face beneath, skin pale and stretched tight over a skull, eyes black and soulless. But they didn't stop. They never stopped. I woke up to the sound of my own screams. My body was strapped to the same steel chair, the chains biting into my flesh. My hand, what was left of it, throbbed painfully, a dull, constant ache that made me want to vomit. Across from me, a camera was positioned, its red light blinking steadily. It was recording. Broadcasting. I was the show now. The tools I had seen before were laid out before me, knives, saws, pliers, each one chosen with precision. This wasn't just torture for torture's sake. This was art to them. The masked figures circled me, slow, methodical, their presence looming over me like death itself. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their silence was more terrifying than any words they could have said. The first cut was shallow, a thin line across my chest, but it was enough to send waves of agony coursing through my body. I gasped, my breath coming in ragged bursts as they continued, the blade slicing deeper, longer. Blood soaked my shirt, dripping onto the floor in thick, red rivulets. The pliers were next, used with a cruel precision to pull at my fingernails. One by one, they wrenched them free, each rip sending shockwaves of pain through my already broken body. My screams filled the room, bouncing off the walls, but no one was coming. No one was going to save me, and then, as if in a final act of cruelty, they pulled out the drill. The same one I had watched Jason suffer under. The bit spun with a high-pitched whir, the sound sending chills down my spine. I knew what was coming. I braced myself, but nothing could have prepared me for the pain that followed. It wasn't just physical anymore. It was psychological. They were breaking me, piece by piece, reducing me to nothing more than a spectacle, just like Jason. And as the darkness crept in, I realized something horrifying. This wasn't the end. I was trapped in their world now, a part of their twisted game. There was no escape, no salvation. Only pain. Only torment. The camera zoomed in on my face as I gasped my last breath, the red light blinking, and then the screen went black. The feed cuts abruptly, leaving the audience in stunned silence. The chat is flooded with confused messages, people asking if it's part of the show or if something went wrong. Some laugh, assuming it's a glitch.